Title: Real American Horror Story, Episode 1, The Haunting of Maple Street. Maple Street was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Nestled in the heart of small-town America, its charm lay in its peacefulness, its old houses, and its close-knit community. But everything changed the day the Miller family moved in. John Miller, his wife Sarah, and their 2 children, Emily and Jake, were excited about their new life in this quaint neighborhood. They had moved from the bustling city, seeking a slower pace of life, and Maple Street seemed perfect. The house they bought was an old Victorian, full of character and history, or so the real estate agent had said. The house had been on the market for years, but the Millers didn't think much of it. They were thrilled to finally have a place of their own. As they settled in, the neighbors came by to introduce themselves. They were warm, welcoming, and full of stories about the town's history. But whenever the conversation turned to the house the Millers had bought, there was always an uncomfortable pause. It was as if the neighbors knew something they didn't, but no one was willing to speak about it. John dismissed it as small-town gossip, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, after the kids were tucked into bed, John and Sarah sat in the living room, admiring their new home. It was then that they first heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Sarah glanced at John, thinking he was trying to scare her, but his puzzled expression told her otherwise. "Did you hear that?" she asked. John nodded, his eyes narrowing as he listened intently. But the whisper was gone, leaving behind only the creaks and groans of the old house settling. The next few days were uneventful, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She noticed things around the house seemed to move on their own. A picture frame would be slightly tilted, a chair would be pulled out, or a door would be ajar that she was certain she had closed. John laughed it off, saying it was just her imagination, but Sarah knew something wasn't right. Then one evening, as she was preparing dinner, she saw it, a shadow, moving across the kitchen wall, with no one there to cast it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she spun around, but the room was empty. She told John about it, but he insisted it was just a trick of the light. But that night, as they lay in bed, they both heard the whispers again, louder this time, more distinct. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with them, but the words were just out of reach. Emily and Jake began to complain about strange noises in their rooms. Emily swore she heard someone calling her name in the middle of the night, while Jake said he saw someone standing at the foot of his bed. John decided to investigate, searching the house from top to bottom. He found nothing, but the feeling of unease persisted. It wasn't until the following week that things took a terrifying turn. Sarah was home alone one afternoon when she heard footsteps upstairs. At first she thought it was one of the kids, but then she remembered they were at school. Her heart raced as she slowly climbed the stairs, each step echoing in the silent house. As she reached the top, the footsteps stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. She opened the door to Emily's room, where the noise had come from, but found it empty. As she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that made her jump. She tried to open it, but the door wouldn't budge, as if someone was holding it from the other side. Panic set in as she pounded on the door, calling for help, but there was no one to hear her. Just as suddenly as it had closed, the door swung open, almost knocking her off balance. She stumbled out of the room, her heart pounding, and ran downstairs. When John came home, he found her sitting on the couch, trembling. She told him what had happened, but he struggled to believe her. However, the fear in her eyes was undeniable, and he promised to get to the bottom of it. That night, they decided to set up cameras around the house, hoping to catch whatever was causing these disturbances. But when they reviewed the footage the next day, what they saw chilled them to the bone. In the middle of the night, the camera in the hallway outside their bedroom captured a shadowy figure moving towards their room. The figure paused at their door before disappearing into thin air. There was no explanation, no logical reason for what they were seeing. But it was undeniable. Something was in their house. Determined to find answers, John and Sarah started digging into the history of the house. They visited the local library, spoke to longtime residents, and even consulted the town's historian. What they discovered was more horrifying than they could have imagined. The house had once belonged to a man named Samuel Blackwood, a wealthy but reclusive figure who lived there in the early 1900s. Blackwood was rumored to have been involved in dark, occult practices, and strange disappearances occurred around the town during his time. One of the most chilling stories was about a young girl named Abigail who vanished without a trace. It was believed that she had been one of Blackwood's victims, taken for some dark ritual. The townspeople had tried to confront Blackwood, but he had disappeared, leaving behind only his house. Since then, every family that had lived in the house reported strange occurrences, and none had stayed longer than a year. Many believed that the house was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered there. John and Sarah were horrified. They realized that whatever was in their house was likely tied to Blackwood's dark past. But leaving wasn't an option. They had invested everything into this home. They decided to fight back, to find a way to cleanse the house of its dark history. The Millers sought help from a local priest, Father O'Connor, who had experience with exorcisms. He was reluctant at first, warning them that such rituals were dangerous, but he agreed after hearing their story. Father O'Connor arrived one evening armed with holy water, a Bible, and a crucifix. The atmosphere in the house was heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on them. The family gathered in the living room as the priest began the ritual, his voice steady and strong as he recited the prayers. But as the ritual progressed, the house seemed to come alive. The lights flickered, shadows moved across the walls, and the temperature dropped to a bone-chilling cold. A low growl echoed through the house, followed by the sound of footsteps running up the stairs. Father O'Connor continued, his voice unwavering, but the presence in the house grew stronger, angrier. Suddenly, the living room door slammed shut, and the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. Sarah screamed as she felt something cold and clammy brush against her arm. John tried to comfort her, but he too was shaken. Father O'Connor threw holy water in the direction of the footsteps, and a deafening roar filled the room. The air was thick with tension, as if the house itself was fighting back. But the priest persisted, shouting prayers and commands for the spirit to leave. For a moment it seemed like it was working. The temperature began to rise, and the shadows receded. But then, with a final furious burst, the presence surged back, knocking Father O'Connor to the ground. The room shook violently, as if an earthquake had hit, and the family clung to each other in terror. And then just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The house fell silent, the air still, and the oppressive feeling lifted. Father O'Connor slowly got to his feet, his face pale and strained. "It's done," he said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. The Millers were relieved. But they couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. For a few weeks, things seemed to return to normal. The strange noises stopped, the whispers ceased, and the house felt like a home again. John and Sarah began to relax, thinking that the exorcism had worked. But deep down, Sarah still felt uneasy. She noticed little things that were out of place, subtle signs that something was still there. She tried to dismiss them, to convince herself that it was just her imagination. But one night, as she was putting Emily to bed, she heard it again. A faint whisper coming from the closet. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Emily looked up at her, her eyes wide with fear. "Mommy, who's in the closet?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sarah's blood ran cold as she slowly turned towards the closet door. It was open, just a crack, and she could see nothing but darkness inside. She reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the door open. The closet was empty, but the whispering continued, louder now, more insistent. Sarah slammed the door shut, grabbed Emily, and ran out of the room. John found her in the hallway, her face pale and her hands shaking. "What happened?" he asked. But she couldn't bring herself to speak. Instead, she pointed to the closet, her eyes wide with fear. John opened the door, but found nothing. He tried to reassure her, but Sarah knew that whatever was in the house was still there, and it was getting stronger. The next night, the Millers were awakened by a loud bang, followed by the sound of shattering glass. They rushed downstairs to find the living room window smashed and the front door wide open. John ran outside, but saw nothing in the darkness. When he came back in, the whispers started again, louder than ever, echoing through the house. The family huddled together in the living room, fear gripping them as the temperature dropped and the shadows danced across the walls. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as a dark figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was the same shadowy figure they had seen on the camera, but now it was more distinct, more menacing. The figure slowly descended the stairs, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. John stepped forward, holding the crucifix that Father O'Connor had left them. "Leave us!" he shouted, his voice trembling. The figure paused, its eyes narrowing as it stared at him. Then with a deafening roar, it lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. The room erupted into chaos as the figure moved towards Sarah and the children, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. But then something strange happened. The figure hesitated, as if it was struggling against something. Its form flickered, becoming less solid, less real. Sarah, clutching the Bible that Father O'Connor had given them, began to recite the Lord's Prayer, her voice shaking but determined. The figure screamed, a sound of pure rage and pain, as it started to dissolve, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. John got to his feet, joining Sarah in the prayer. The figure writhed, its movements growing more frantic, more desperate. And then with one final ear-piercing scream, it vanished, leaving behind only silence. The Millers stood there, trembling, hardly believing what had just happened. The house was still, the oppressive atmosphere gone. But they knew that the battle wasn't truly over. They had won this round, but the dark history of the house was still there, lurking in the shadows. The next morning, the family decided to leave Maple Street for good. They packed their things and moved out, leaving the haunted house behind. As they drove away, Sarah glanced back at the house, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. She realized that the house had been a reflection of the darkness that can reside within people. The evil that had taken root in the house was a result of the dark deeds of its past inhabitants. It was a reminder that our actions, no matter how small, can leave a lasting impact, and that sometimes the only way to truly move forward is to confront our past, no matter how painful it may be. The Millers never spoke of the house again, but they carried the lesson with them. They learned that sometimes the scariest things in life aren't ghosts or monsters, but the consequences of our own actions, and that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to face it head-on. End of Episode 1, The Haunting of Maple Street.